The rain lashed against the towering glass windows of Horizon Innovations headquarters in Seattle, a sleek monolith piercing the stormy sky on a late September evening in 2025. Inside the 42nd floor boardroom, the air was thick with tension, heavier than the storm clouds outside. The room, bathed in the golden glow of a crystal chandelier, was a study in opulence. A long mahogany table stretched across the space, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflecting the strained faces of the company's most brilliant minds. Crystal water glasses, untouched, caught the light, their delicate clinks the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Vance, the CEO, a woman whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back tightly, her piercing green eyes scanning the room with a mix of impatience and barely concealed fury. Her hands, adorned with a single silver ring, gripped a stack of papers. Documents written entirely in French, delivered just hours ago by Mr. Adrien Dubois, a Swiss investor whose calm demeanor only heightened the room's unease. The papers were the key to a multi-million-dollar deal, one that could propel Horizon Innovations into the European market. But there was a problem. Not a single person in the room could read them. Eleanor's gaze swept over her team executives with Ivy League degrees, analysts who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and strategists who prided themselves on their foresight. Yet now they sat frozen, their eyes darting to one another, hoping someone else would speak. The silence stretched unbearable, each second ticking by with the weight of a guillotine. Mr. Dubois, seated across from Eleanor, leaned back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes moving from one executive to another, his lips curved in a faint, almost amused smile. He had flown from Geneva for this meeting, and his patience was a stark contrast to the growing panic around him. The documents, dense with legal jargon and financial projections, were critical, and he had made it clear: no translation, no deal. The clock on the wall, a grand, ornate piece that seemed to mock the room's stillness, ticked louder, its rhythm a metronome to the executive's rising dread. Sweat beaded on the forehead of Michael Harper, the chief financial officer whose tailored suit did little to hide his discomfort. Beside him, Sarah Lynn, the head of operations, stared at her notepad, her pen frozen mid-scribble. Even Thomas Reed, the charismatic head of marketing who could charm anyone, looked pale, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous twitch. Eleanor's patience snapped. Her hand slammed down on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Glasses rattled and heads jerked up, startled. "Is there seriously no one in this room who can read this?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. The executives flinched, their careers flashing before their eyes. Reputations built over decades teetered on the edge of collapse. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her anger, the chandelier's light casting harsh shadows across their faces. Mr. Dubois raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable, but the faintest hint of disappointment flickered in his eyes. He adjusted his cufflinks, waiting as if testing the room's resolve. The silence grew heavier, oppressive, until a soft, trembling voice cut through it like a knife through silk. "Excuse me, ma'am." "I can." The words came from the back of the room, so unexpected that they seemed to hang in the air, fragile yet resolute. Every head turned, eyes wide with shock. The voice didn't belong to an executive, a manager, or even an assistant. It came from Clara Monroe, a young janitor in her early 20s, standing near the service door with a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. Her navy blue uniform was crisp but plain, her dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail, and her hazel eyes, wide with nervousness, locked onto Eleanor's. The room froze, the only sound, the faint drip of water from Clara's mop hitting the bucket. For a moment, no one moved. The executives exchanged glances, Some skeptical, others incredulous, a few tinged with mockery. Michael whispered something to Sarah, who stifled a scoff. Thomas leaned forward, his brow furrowed as if trying to place this stranger who dared to speak. Mr. Dubois tilted his head, his gaze sharpening with curiosity. Eleanor's face was a mask of disbelief, her lips parting slightly as she processed the audacity of the interruption. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She clutched the mop tighter, her knuckles whitening, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had been invisible for the past hour, quietly cleaning the edges of the room while the executives debated and faltered. She had watched the tension build, heard the desperation in Eleanor's voice, and felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Clara wasn't supposed to be here, not in the spotlight, not in the conversation. Her job was to clean, to fade into the background, to be unnoticed. But the documents those pages covered in French had stirred something in her. She knew she could read them. She knew she could help. But speaking up meant risking everything. Her job, her anonymity, the fragile stability she had built. Her mind raced, flashing back to her life in New Orleans, where she had grown up in a cramped apartment with her mother, a diner waitress, who worked double shifts to keep them afloat. Clara had always loved languages, sneaking into the public library after school to borrow French textbooks, teaching herself verbs and conjugations under the flickering light of a second-hand lamp. It was her escape, her dream of a bigger world, even when life seemed determined to keep her small. The room's silence pressed harder, and Clara felt the weight of every stare. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp but controlled. You can read French." There was no kindness in her tone, only skepticism, but Clara nodded, her voice steadier now. "Yes, ma'am, I can." Whispers erupted among the executives, a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Michael leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression saying he'd believe it when he saw it. Sarah's pen tapped rapidly against her notepad, a nervous rhythm. Thomas, ever the opportunist, flashed a cautious smile, as if sensing a shift in the room's dynamic. Mr. Dubois said nothing, but his gaze lingered on Clara, assessing her with the precision of a man who missed nothing. Eleanor hesitated, her jaw tightening, then pushed the stack of papers toward the edge of the table. "Prove it," she said, her voice a challenge. Clara set down her mop, her hands trembling as she walked forward. The distance from the service door to the table felt endless, every step echoing in the silent room. She reached the table, her fingers brushing the crisp pages, and for a moment she froze. The words stared back at her, familiar yet daunting, under the scrutiny of so many eyes. She took a deep breath, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. "You're more than they think, Clara. Always remember that." She began to read, her voice soft, at first stumbling over the first sentence. "The agreement stipulates a joint venture for renewable energy projects, with a focus on solar infrastructure in the Alpine region." She paused, glancing up, expecting ridicule, but the room was silent, waiting. Emboldened, she continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident. Sentence by sentence, she translated the dense legal text into clear, precise English, her accent carrying a faint southern lilt that made the words oddly lyrical. Mr. Dubois leaned forward, his faint smile widening. The executives, once dismissive, now listened intently, some jotting notes, others exchanging glances of reluctant admiration. Eleanor's expression softened, though her eyes remained guarded, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Clara's hands steadied as she turned the pages, her mind racing to keep up with the complex terms, phrases like equity distribution and regulatory compliance that she had only encountered in borrowed books. Yet she didn't falter. The storm outside raged on thunder, rumbling in the distance. But inside the boardroom, a different kind of storm was calming. Clara finished the first page and looked up, her breath catching as she realized every eye was on her. Mr. Dubois nodded, a gesture so subtle it was almost missed, but it carried weight. "Continuous," he said softly, his French crisp and encouraging. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she managed a small nod, responding in French, "Merci, monsieur. Je vais continuer." "Thank you, sir. I will continue." The room exhaled the tension, easing but not vanishing. Eleanor sat back, her hands unclenching, for the first time her gaze fixed on Clara, with a mix of curiosity and something close to respect. The executives, though still wary, leaned forward, their skepticism giving way to fascination. Clara, the janitor, who had been invisible moments ago, was now the center of the room. Her voice, the only thing holding the deal and their futures together. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this single act of courage was about to change everything. As she turned to the next page, her heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. Hope. The storm outside roared, but inside, Clara Monroe was rewriting her story, one word at a time. The boardroom's chandelier still glowed faintly as the meeting adjourned, its light casting long shadows across the now empty mahogany table. Clara Monroe stood alone by the service door, her mop and bucket forgotten in the corner, her hands still trembling from the weight of what she had just done. The executives had filed out, some casting curious glances her way, others avoiding her gaze entirely. Mr. Adrien Dubois, the Swiss investor, had paused to offer her a nod, his eyes crinkling with a warmth that felt like validation. Eleanor Vance, the CEO, had said nothing, but her piercing green eyes lingered on Clara before she swept out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The storm outside Seattle's Horizon Innovations headquarters raged on, rain streaking the glass walls. But inside Clara's mind, a different storm churned memories of a life that had taught her to stay invisible, to keep her dreams small, and yet had led her to this moment. She clutched the edge of her navy blue janitor's uniform, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and fear. She had translated the French documents flawlessly, saving a deal that could have collapsed. But now, the weight of every skeptical stare, every whispered doubt pressed down on her. What had she done? Had she overstepped? Would they laugh at her, a janitor who dared to speak in a room of power? As she gathered her cleaning supplies, her mind drifted back to New Orleans, to the life that had shaped her, to the girl who had learned French not for glory, but for survival. Clara's childhood home in New Orleans was a narrow, weathered shotgun house on a street where the air always smelled of jasmine and fryer grease. The paint peeled from the walls, and the roof leaked during hurricanes, but it was home. Her mother, Lorraine, worked 16-hour shifts at a diner, her hands rough from washing dishes, her smile weary but fierce. Clara's older brother, Jonah, had been the light of their family, a lanky teenager with dreams of becoming a musician. He'd play his second-hand guitar on the porch, filling the humid nights with melodies that made neighbors pause and listen. Clara, barely 10, would sit cross-legged beside him, her nose buried in library books about French, Spanish, and Italian languages that felt like doorways to worlds she'd never see. "Why you always reading those?" Clara, Jonah would tease, strumming a chord. "You gonna talk to the whole world someday." She'd blush, hiding behind her book, but his words planted a seed. Languages were her escape from the cramped house, the unpaid bills, the constant hum of worry in her mother's voice. French, with its rolling R's and elegant phrases, was her favorite. It felt like music, like Jonah's guitar, a way to make sense of a chaotic world. But then, Jonah got sick. It started with a cough, then fevers that wouldn't break. The doctor said leukemia, a word that landed like a sledgehammer. Clara was 12 when he died, and the loss carved a hole in her family that never healed. Lorraine stopped smiling, her shifts at the diner growing longer as medical bills piled up. Clara, too young to work, but old enough to feel the weight, took on odd jobs, babysitting, cleaning neighbors' porches, anything to help. School became a luxury, her dreams of college fading as she spent evenings at the library teaching herself French from battered textbooks. She'd whisper phrases to herself, "Je suis, tu es, nous sommes," as if they could hold her together when everything else was falling apart. By 16, she was working after school at a corner store, her hands stained with newsprint, and her heart heavy with responsibility. French became her secret rebellion, a way to prove she was more than the world's expectations. She'd sit up late, her mother asleep on the couch, practicing verb conjugations by candlelight when the power was cut off. "You're gonna be something," Clara Lorraine would murmur in rare moments of hope. "Don't let this place hold you back." When Clara was 18, Lorraine's health began to falter. Years of overwork had taken their toll. They moved to Seattle, chasing a cousin's promise of better jobs. But the city was cold and unforgiving. Clara found work as a janitor at Horizon Innovations, scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans in a skyscraper that gleamed with wealth she'd never touch. At night, she cleaned offices downtown, her hands raw from bleach, her mind alive with French podcasts and online courses she accessed on a cracked phone. She'd practice in the empty offices, whispering bonjour to the darkness, imagining a life where she wasn't invisible. Her mother, now too weak to work, relied on Clara's income, and the pressure kept her awake at night. Yet she never stopped learning, never stopped dreaming. Even when the world seemed to scream that she was just a janitor, nothing more. French was her lifeline, a reminder that she carried a spark no one could see. Back in the present, Clara snapped out of her reverie as the boardroom door swung open. Eleanor Vance stood there, her silhouette sharp against the hallway's fluorescent light. "Clara, is it?" she said, her voice clipped, but not unkind. Clara nodded, her throat dry. "Walk with me." The command left no room for refusal. Clara followed, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor, her heart hammering as they entered Eleanor's corner office. The view was breathtaking, Seattle's skyline glittering through the rain, but Clara barely noticed. Eleanor sat behind her desk, the French documents spread out before her. "You surprised me today," she said, her tone unreadable. "Where did you learn to speak French like that?" Clara hesitated, her instinct to shrink back warring with the need to be honest. She told her story in halting words: New Orleans, Jonah's death, her mother's struggles, the library books, the late-night studying. Eleanor listened, her face impassive, but her eyes softened slightly, a flicker of something Clara couldn't name. "You took a risk speaking up," Eleanor said finally. "Some might call it reckless." Clara's stomach dropped, but Eleanor continued. "But you saved us today." Mr. Dubois was impressed. "That's not easy to do." Clara managed a small nod, her cheeks flushing. Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Why didn't you tell anyone you could do this? Why hide it?" Clara swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would care, ma'am. I'm just the janitor." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Clara feared she'd said too much. But then Eleanor stood pacing to the window. "Talent doesn't care about titles," she said, almost to herself. "But not everyone here will see it that way. You understand that, don't you?" Clara nodded, her mind flashing to the executive's skeptical glances, Michael's whispered comment. Sarah's stifled scoff. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Eleanor turned back her expression resolute. I'm giving you a chance. A trial position as a translator. You'll work with the international team starting tomorrow. But don't expect it to be easy. They'll test you. They'll doubt you. Can you handle that? Clara's heart leapt, but fear coiled around it. She thought of her mother, of Jonah's guitar, of the French words that had carried her through the darkest nights. Yes, ma'am, she said, her voice steady now. I can? As Clara left the office, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the city lights blurring through the wet glass. She stepped into the elevator, her janitor's uniform feeling heavier than ever, but her heart lighter. The executive's doubts lingered in her mind, but so did Mr. Dubois' nod. Eleanor's words, her own courage. She had spent years hiding, convincing herself she was nothing more than a janitor, but today she had been seen. Tomorrow she would walk into Horizon Innovations not as Clara the cleaner, but as Clara the translator. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to smile a small defiant curve of her lips. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was something more, something she had always been, even if the world hadn't noticed until now. The fluorescent lights of Horizon Innovations International Division buzzed softly, a stark contrast to the stormy night of Clara Monroe's unexpected debut in the boardroom 2 weeks ago. Now, on a crisp October morning in 2025, Clara stood in a small cubicle on the 38th floor of the Seattle skyscraper. Her navy blue janitor's uniform replaced by a modest blazer and slacks borrowed from her cousin. The outfit felt foreign stiff against her skin, but it was a symbol of her new role translator and assistant to the international team. Her desk was a cluttered island in a sea of glass-walled offices surrounded by executives who moved with the confidence of those born to power. Clara's heart thudded as she adjusted her headset, preparing for her first major task, a virtual meeting with a French client, Madame Claire Beaumont, whose renewable energy firm was considering a partnership with Horizon. The weight of expectation pressed down on her heavier than any mop or bucket she'd ever carried. She wasn't just translating words today, she was carrying the hopes of a company still reeling from its near disaster with Mr. Dubois. But the whispers followed her, sharp and cutting, from colleagues who saw her as an intruder, a janitor playing dress-up in a world where she didn't belong. Clara's first days in her new role had been a trial by fire. The international team, led by Michael Harper, the chief financial officer who'd scoffed at her in the boardroom, treated her with a mix of suspicion and condescension. Michael, with his tailored suits and perpetual smirk, made no effort to hide his doubts. "Don't get too comfortable, Clara," he'd said on her first day, his tone dripping with patronizing amusement. "This isn't a fairy tale." Sarah Lynn, the head of operations, was politer, but no less skeptical. Her tight smiles betraying her belief that Clara's presence was a fluke, a temporary indulgence by Eleanor Vance. Only Thomas Reed, the marketing head, offered occasional encouragement, his charming grin masking his own ambition to stay in Eleanor's good graces. Clara felt their eyes on her, waiting for her to stumble to prove she was out of her depth. Yet she refused to let their doubts define her. Each night after long hours at the office, she pored over French business terminology, legal contracts, and cultural nuances, her cracked phone screen glowing as she memorized phrases like force majeure and bilan comptable. She wasn't just preparing for a job, she was fighting for her place in a world that had never invited her in. The meeting with Madame Beaumont was a crucible. Clara sat at a conference table, a laptop open before her as the team gathered around a large screen. Eleanor, present via video call from New York, watched with her usual intensity her green eyes sharp even through the pixelated feed. Madame Beaumont, a poised woman with silver-streaked hair, spoke rapidly in French, her tone brisk and uncompromising. Clara translated in real time, her voice steady but her palms slick with sweat. Madame Beaumont emphasizes that the partnership must prioritize sustainable practices with a commitment to carbon neutrality. By 2030, Clara said, her words clear and precise. The team nodded, but Michael leaned back. His arms crossed, his expression skeptical. As the discussion deepened, Madame Beaumont presented a draft contract dense with clauses about liability and profit sharing. Clara's eyes scanned the document, her mind racing to keep up. Then she caught it, a subtle discrepancy in the French text, a clause that could expose Horizon to millions in unforeseen costs if misinterpreted. Her heart skipped. Should she speak up? Risk looking foolish? She glanced at Michael, whose eyes narrowed, daring her to falter. Clara took a breath, her voice cutting through the room's hum. "Excuse me, Madame Beaumont," she said in fluent French. "There appears to be an inconsistency in Clause 7.2 regarding liability for third-party delays. Could we clarify the intent?" The room stilled. Madame Beaumont's brows lifted, then she smiled, a rare crack in her professional facade. "Vous avez l'œil vif, mademoiselle," she replied. "You have a sharp eye, miss." She explained the clause, confirming Clara's suspicion, and the team quickly adjusted their approach, avoiding a costly oversight. Eleanor's face on the screen softened, a flicker of approval in her gaze. Thomas clapped Clara on the shoulder, his grin genuine for once. Even Sarah's tight smile loosened, though Michael's jaw tightened, his pride bruised. Clara's chest swelled with quiet triumph, but she kept her expression neutral, focusing on the next line of translation. She had proven herself, but she knew this was only the beginning. Outside the meeting, Clara's presence stirred ripples. Some colleagues like Emily, a young intern struggling to keep up with the team's demands, saw Clara as an inspiration. Emily, barely 19, had been hired as a favor to a board member and was drowning in the fast-paced environment. During a lunch break in the cafeteria, Clara noticed Emily hunched over a stack of papers, her eyes red from frustration. Clara hesitated. She knew what it felt like to be overlooked, but then sat beside her. "Need a hand?" she asked softly. Emily looked up startled, then nodded. Clara spent the next hour explaining a French marketing report, breaking down complex terms with patience. "How do you know all this?" Emily asked, awe in her voice. Clara smiled a little sadly. "I learned because I had to." That moment sparked a quiet mentorship with Clara, guiding Emily through her tasks, teaching her to navigate the corporate maze. Emily's confidence grew, and Clara found a purpose beyond translation. She was helping someone else find their voice, just as she was finding hers. But not everyone warmed to her. Michael in particular grew colder, his comments laced with barbs. "Don't get cocky, Clara," he muttered one day after she corrected a translation error in a team email. "You're still the new kid." Clara bit her tongue, but the words stung, echoing the voices from her past teachers who'd told her she'd never amount to much, landlords who'd sneered at her mother's late rent payments. She pushed the doubts down, focusing on her work, but the hostility wore on her. Late one evening, alone in her cubicle, she found a note slipped under her keyboard, "Know your place." The words, scrawled in sharp ink, hit like a punch. She stared at them, her hands shaking, memories of New Orleans flooding back, nights when she'd felt invisible, worthless, just a girl with dreams too big for her circumstances. She crumpled the note, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let them break her. That night, Clara took a bus to her mother's small apartment in a rundown Seattle neighborhood. Lorraine, frail but fierce, sat wrapped in a quilt, her eyes lighting up as Clara walked in. "How's my scholar doing?" she asked, her voice weak but warm. Clara knelt beside her, the weight of the day spilling out. She told her about the meeting, the contract, the note. Lorraine listened, her hand squeezing Clara's. "You're stronger than they know," she said. "You always have been." Clara's eyes stung with tears, but she smiled, the words anchoring her. She thought of Jonah, his guitar, the way he'd believed in her. She thought of the library books, the candlelit nights, the French words that had carried her through. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her mother, for Jonah's memory, for every invisible person who'd ever been told they weren't enough. The next morning, Clara returned to Horizon, her chin high despite the whispers. She wore her borrowed blazer like armor, her heart steady with purpose. The international team was preparing for another round of talks with Madame Beaumont, and Clara was ready. She didn't just translate. She anticipated. She strategized. She bridged cultural gaps with an empathy the executives lacked. When Madame Beaumont praised her directly, saying, Votre perspicacité est rare, your insight is rare, Clara felt a spark of pride she hadn't allowed herself before. Even Sarah, usually reserved, offered a quiet, good job as the meeting ended. Michael said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He was watching, waiting, but Clara no longer cared. She had saved the company millions, earned the respect of a client, and found an ally in Emily. The note under her keyboard faded into insignificance. Clara Monroe was no longer just a janitor, no longer just a translator. She was a force, and she was only getting started. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in Seattle glittered under a cascade of crystal chandeliers, the air filled with the clink of champagne glasses and the hum of polished conversation. It was October 2026, a year since Clara Monroe had stepped out of the shadows in Horizon Innovation's boardroom, her voice breaking through the silence to save a critical deal. Now at the company's annual gala, she stood at the edge of the room, no longer in a janitor's uniform or borrowed blazer, but in a simple, elegant navy dress that hugged her frame with quiet confidence. Her hazel eyes, once wide with fear, now shone with purpose as she scanned the crowd. Executives, investors, and clients mingling in a sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns. The past year had transformed her life, but tonight was more than a celebration of her rise from janitor to cultural liaison. It was a testament to the courage that had carried her here, a courage that had reshaped not only her future, but the hearts of those around her. Clara's journey had become a quiet legend at Horizon, whispered in boardrooms and break rooms alike, but she carried it with humility, her focus fixed on the work still ahead. Tonight, though, the spotlight would find her again, and she was ready. Clara's new role as cultural liaison had thrust her into the heart of Horizon's international operations. She led negotiations with European firms, her fluency in French, and growing proficiency in Spanish bridging gaps that contracts alone couldn't. Her empathy, honed by years of hardship in New Orleans, made her a natural diplomat, sensing unspoken tensions and navigating cultural nuances with ease. But the path hadn't been smooth. Michael Harper, the chief financial officer who'd once scoffed at her, remained a thorn in her side, his skepticism morphing into subtle sabotage. He'd question her translations in meetings, nitpick her reports, and once in a heated moment muttered, "You're still just the help, Clara." The words stung, echoing the cruel note she'd found under her keyboard months ago. But Clara had grown stronger. She'd learned to meet his barbs with calm precision, letting her work speak louder than his disdain. Other colleagues, like Sarah Lynn, had softened their initial doubts, replaced by grudging respect. Thomas Reed, ever the opportunist, now sought her input on marketing strategies, his charm less calculated, more genuine. And Emily, the intern Clara had mentored, had blossomed into a confident assistant, her gratitude a quiet bond between them. Tonight's gala marked the signing of a landmark deal with a French solar energy consortium, a deal Clara had spearheaded. As she sipped sparkling water, her eyes caught Eleanor Vance's across the room. The CEO, resplendent in a crimson gown, gave her a subtle nod, a gesture that carried the weight of their shared history. Clara's mind drifted to the moment a month ago when she'd faced Michael head-on. During a tense negotiation with the French consortium, he'd challenged her translation of a key clause implying she'd misinterpreted a financial term. The room had stilled the French clients watching closely. Clara, unfazed, pulled up the original document on her tablet, her voice steady as she explained the nuance in French, then English, proving her accuracy. The clients nodded, impressed, and Michael's face reddened, his authority undercut. Later in private, Eleanor had pulled Clara aside. "You didn't just win that argument," she'd said. "You won their trust. That's rarer." The memory bolstered Clara now, her shoulders straightening as she prepared for the evening's spotlight. The gala's program began, and Eleanor took the stage, her voice commanding the room's attention. She spoke of Horizon's growth, the New Deal, and the team's resilience. Then her tone shifted softer, but no less powerful. "A year ago, we nearly lost a critical opportunity because we overlooked talent in our own ranks," she said, her eyes finding Clara. "One person changed that. Clara Monroe, please join me." The room erupted in applause, but Clara's heart raced, her palms damp as she walked to the stage. The sea of faces, some warm, some curious, a few resentful, watched her ascent. Michael, seated near the front, stared at his glass, his jaw tight. Clara stood beside Eleanor, her smile small but steady. Clara didn't just translate words. Eleanor continued. She translated possibility, reminding us that greatness can come from anywhere. The applause swelled, and Clara's throat tightened, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She thought of her mother, Lorraine, watching the live stream from their apartment, her frail hands clasped in pride. After the gala, Clara slipped away, needing air. She stepped onto the hotel's terrace, the Seattle skyline twinkling against the night. Her mind wandered to New Orleans, to the life she'd left behind. The next day, she'd booked a flight home, her first visit in a year. The trip was more than a reunion. It was a pilgrimage. In New Orleans, Clara walked the familiar streets of her old neighborhood, the air thick with humidity and memories. The shotgun house where she'd grown up was still there, its paint more faded, its porch sagging. Neighbors greeted her, their eyes wide at her transformation. "You made it," Clara, an old friend, said, hugging her tightly. But Clara didn't feel like she'd made it. She felt like she was still becoming, still carrying the girl who'd whispered French verbs by candlelight. At her mother's urging, Clara visited the local community center, a crumbling building where kids gathered after school. She saw herself in their faces, hungry for more, but trapped by circumstance. That visit sparked an idea. Clara returned to Seattle with a plan, pitching it to Eleanor in a quiet meeting. "I want to start a language program for kids in underserved areas," she said, her voice firm. "French, Spanish, whatever they want to learn. It'll give them a way out, like it did for me." Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "Do it. Horizon will fund it." Clara threw herself into the project, partnering with community centers in Seattle and New Orleans. She taught classes herself, her evenings filled with the chatter of kids conjugating verbs, their laughter echoing her own childhood dreams. One girl, a shy 12-year-old named Maya, reminded Clara of herself clutching a worn French dictionary like a lifeline. "You're gonna talk to the world someday," Clara told her, echoing Jonah's words. Maya's smile was a mirror of Clara's own hope. Back at Horizon, Clara's influence grew. She led more negotiations, her confidence a quiet force that disarmed even the toughest clients. Michael, chastened by his earlier defeat, kept his distance. His hostility reduced to silence. Sarah became an ally, collaborating with Clara on cross-cultural training for the team. Emily, now a full-time employee, credited Clara in her first performance review, calling her a mentor who'd changed her life. Clara's program, named Speak Bright, expanded, drawing attention from local news and even a national education blog. But Clara's proudest moment came in New Orleans during a visit to the community center. Lorraine, stronger now with better medical care, attended the first class watching as Clara taught a room of kids. Afterward, Lorraine pulled her close, whispering Jonah would be so proud. Clara's tears fell freely, then her heart full. At the gala's close, Eleanor found Clara on the terrace. "You've changed this company," she said, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard. "Not just with your work, but with your heart. Don't ever stop." Clara nodded, her eyes on the city lights. She thought of Jonah's guitar, her mother's quilt, the kids in her classes, the note that had told her to know her place. She'd found her place not just at Horizon, but in the world. She was a bridge, a voice, a reminder that courage could rewrite any story. As the gala ended, Clara stepped back into the ballroom, her dress catching the light, her heart steady with purpose. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was Clara Monroe, and her legacy was just beginning.